Eventually, federal legislation such as the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, the Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Act in 1972 were passed, providing federal protection for workers. As a result, there has been little growth of unions in the private and blue-collar sectors since membership peaked in the 1950s. The historical perspective of unionization in nursing. Collective bargaining was slow in coming to the healthcare industry for many reasons. Until labor laws were amended, unionization of healthcare workers was illegal. So then in 1974, Congress amended the Wagner Act, extending national labor laws to private nonprofit hospitals, nursing homes, health clinics, health maintenance organizations, and other healthcare institutions. These amendments opened the door to much union activity for professions in the public employee sector. Unions on page 219, unions representing nurses. The Service Employees International Union, the SEIU, is a large union in the healthcare industry, and it represents more than 1.5 million nurses. Other unions that represent nurses include the ANA, which has about 172,000 members as of 2016. Another one is the United Steelworkers of America, the American Federation of Government Employees, and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Union representation also varies by state. The states with most unions organizing for all industries, including healthcare, are New York, California, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Illinois. New York had the highest union membership rate, where South Carolina continues to have the lowest. Why do nurses want to join the union? What are motivators? There are 6 primary motivations for joining a union. The first is to increase the power of the individual. Employees know that singly they are much more dispensable. Because a large group of employees is generally less dispensable, nurses greatly increase their bargaining power and reduce their vulnerability by joining a union. And then to achieve wage advantages. They join, the second reason for joining the union, think of it as economics. Because pay is neither fair nor competitive, and many economists agree that joining a union is typically an effective means of raising one's pay. Another reason nurses join the union is to communicate their aims, feelings, and complaints and ideas to others. The desire to have input into organizational decision making is a strong motivator for people to join unions. The feeling of powerlessness or the perception that administration does not care about employees is one of the most common reasons for seeking unionization. Another reason is nurses join the unions because they want to eliminate discrimination and favoritism. Because unions emphasize equality and fairness. The fourth primary motivation for joining a union stems from the social need to be accepted. Another reason nurses join unions is that the union contract dictates that all nurses belong to the union. And finally, some nurses join unions because they believe that patient outcomes are better in unionized organizations because of better staffing and supervised management practices. What are reasons or motivators not to join the unions? Many people distrust unions because they believe that they promote the welfare state and oppose the U.S. system of free enterprise. Others reject unions because they feel a need to demonstrate that they can get ahead on their own merits. Some professional employees reject unions for reasons that deal with class and education. They argue that unions were appropriate for the blue-collar worker, but not for the university professor, physician, or engineer. Nurses reject unions on this basis are usually driven by a need to demonstrate their individualism and social status. Other employees identify with management, thus frequently adopt this viewpoint towards unions, and these nurses reject unions because their values are more closely aligned with management than with workers. Some nurses reject unions because of the fear of employer reprisal. Nurses who reject unions on this basis could be said to be motivated most of all by a need for job security. And finally, some employees reject unions because they fear losing income associated with strike or a walkout. They fear losing income associated with a strike or walkout. Organizations with unfair management policies are more likely to become unionized. But managers can encourage feelings of power by allowing subordinates to have input into decisions that will affect their work. Managers can also listen to ideas, complaints, and feelings and take steps to ensure that favoritism and discrimination are not part of their management styles. Also, managers can strengthen the drives and needs that make nurses reject unions. When nurses begin showing signs of job dissatisfaction, such as frustration, stress, perceived powerlessness, they are sending a wake-up call to nursing management. And leaders must be alert to employment practices that are unfair or insensitive to employee needs and intervene appropriately before such issues lead to unionization. Who is eligible for union membership? Up until 2 decades ago, only supervisors in nursing were considered managers, and as such, they were prohibited from joining unions. However, a 2006 NLRB ruling deemed that charge nurses might also be considered supervisors because they are responsible for the coordination and provision of patient care throughout a unit. So there is on page 223, the Oakwood ruling is still in effect today. That was, they had an organization where they defined what supervisors were within the meaning of the NLRA, and thus could be excluded from a unit of nurses represented by a union. So it specifies that nurses on average with less than 10 to 15%, which is equal to about 1 shift per pay period of their total work time as charge nurses, are considered staff nurses, whereas nurses working more than 15% of their professional time as charge nurses are considered supervisors. So, organizing a union and seeking representation. This is on page 223. Unions use a variety of tactics when organizing healthcare workers. The first step in seeking union representation is determining that adequate levels of desire for unionization exist. The NLRB requires that at least 30% of employees sign an interest card before an election for unionization can be held. Most collective bargaining agents, however, require 60 to 70% of employees to sign interest cards before they begin organizing campaign. So remember, most collective bargaining agents require 60 to 70% of the employees to sign interest cards before they begin organizing campaign. Although even after enough interest cards have been signed, the organization has to hold an election. And at that time, all employees of the same classification vote on whether they desire unionization. A choice in every such election is no representation, which means that the voters do not want a union. During the election, 50% plus one of the petitioned units must vote before the union can be recognized. So during the election, 50% plus one of the petitioned units must vote before the union can be recognized. So if you have 100 people voting, you need 50% plus one. So you need 51. They must vote before the union can be recognized. Unions can also be decertified by a process like that of certification. Decertification can occur when at least 30% of the eligible employees in the bargaining unit initiate a petition asking to no longer be represented by the union. The solicitation and distribution of union literature are banned entirely in immediate patient care areas. So, on page Labor Management and Relationships, it's page 223 to 24. So, in the last 30 years, employers and unions have substantially improved their relationships. They have that contemporary management has come to accept the reality that unions are here to stay. Businesses in the United States are still less comfortable with unions than their counterparts in many other countries. So there is a type of union acceptance known as accommodation. This is on page 224. And as increasingly common, accommodation is characterized by management's full acceptance of the union, with both union and management showing mutual respect. When dealing with unions, managers must be flexible. It is critical that they do not ignore issues or try to overwhelm others with power. The rational approach to problem solving must be used. And it is important to remember that employees have a right to participate in union organizing under the NLRA, and managers must not interfere with this right. Prohibited managerial activities, including threatening employees, interrogating employees, promising employees rewards for cessation of union activity, and spying on unions. However, if management picks up early clues of union activity, the organization may be able to take legitimate steps that will discourage unionization of its employees. The NLRB recognizes the ANA at most state levels as a collective bargaining agent. The NLRB recognizes the ANA at most state levels as a collective bargaining agent. Then on to nurses and strikes. The bottom of page 224 to 225. The NLRA states In part, that employees shall have the right to engage in other concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. The law gives union members time to work together to determine whether strikes are necessary to achieve desired goals. Such strikes, however, are not allowed without giving the employer and the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service 10 days notice of the intent to strike. By doing that, the facility should have reasonable amount of time to stop admitting patients, transfer existing patients to other facilities, and reduce medical procedures that require nurse-intensive labor. So remember, strikes are not allowed without giving the employer and the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service 10 days notice of the intent to strike. The controversy over whether nurses should strike is long-standing and is likely at the heart of why so many individuals fear union activities. Critics of nurses having the ability to strike suggest that it is unethical because it leaves patients without care providers. However, the ANA has held consistently for 50 years that nurses not only have the right to strike, but also have a professional responsibility and ethical duty to do so if it means maintaining work conditions conducive to providing high quality care. Ironically, though, both proponents and opponents of strikes in nursing argue that they aim for the same goal: safe patient care. Strikes may be ethically justified in three circumstances. The first occurs when one fully understands a policy being contested and still feels the conclusion or action is unjust. The second is when the employer has remained indifferent to other forms of negotiation. And the third is when the employee is willing to undergo personal inconveniences in the face of achieving justice. For a strike to be justified, the cause must be realistic. But think about the moral dilemmas related to the decision to strike. Nurses must also determine how they feel about crossing the picket line should a strike occur. Nurses do have a choice not to participate in strikes or to cross picket lines when strikes occur, but they risk derision by their peers in doing so. However, because strikebreakers, commonly known as scabs, are viewed as taking the management's issue on the management side on the issue and may never be fully accepted by their peers after the strike action has ended. So, you got to think nurses' long-standing struggle to be recognized as a profession underscores concerns that the profession's involvement in collective bargaining associations historically reserved for blue-collar industries may undermine this goal. Some nurses think that union activities draw attention away from patients and patient-related activities. And then there are also those issues related to who can belong to a union and what the definition of supervisor is in nursing and whether strikes and walkouts are ethically justified for nursing professionals. That is the end of chapter 15. Have a great week.